I knew the Harrow name before I understood what it meant to Daniel. It was carved above the entrance to Westbridge's old concert hall, printed on plaques inside the county museum, and attached to portraits of stern men who had once controlled the region's textile mills. For generations, the Harrows had been the family people mentioned when they wanted to describe influence without using the word money. Daniel had deliberately stepped away from that world. He became a public school teacher, rented a modest townhouse near the river, and wore jackets until the elbows needed patches. His mother considered teaching a respectable hobby rather than a serious career. Daniel rarely spoke about that. "It's one of the reasons I love you," he told me after we had been dating for 6 months. "You don't care who my relatives are." I laughed and said he was right. Only later did I notice how carefully he always said "my relatives," as though he were describing people he had survived rather than people he belonged to. I met them at Ravenshore, the family's lake property outside Bryan County. The house was enormous, with gray shingles, stone chimneys, and a porch facing the water. From a distance, it looked like a postcard. Up close, I noticed different things. The paint beneath the porch railing was peeling, a dark stain spread across the ceiling near the staircase. One of the windows had been sealed with clear tape along the frame. Evelyn Harrow greeted me wearing pearls and a pale blue dress. She held my hand slightly too long and looked past me toward my truck. "And which family do you garden for?" she asked. "I own a commercial grounds and maintenance company," I said. "We handle landscaping, property care, and winter services." Her smile remained perfectly still. "Oh," she replied, "so you work in gardening?" She said it gently, as though correcting a child who had used a word that was too large. During dinner, Daniel's aunt asked whether I could recommend someone inexpensive to prune her roses. His cousin joked that at least Daniel would never have to pay for lawn care again. Everyone laughed. I laughed too because I had not yet learned that politeness can become permission when used too often. On the drive home, I asked Daniel whether his mother disliked me. "She's cautious with new people," he said. "Give her time." I told myself that was reasonable. Old families had traditions. Mothers imagined weddings long before their sons met the women they would marry. Evelyn probably needed time to adjust.
At our engagement dinner, my fiancé's mother pushed a prenuptial agreement across the table and said, loudly enough for every guest to hear, "Sign it, fortune hunter." 58 conversations died at once. I looked at the silver pen beside the document, then at the faces surrounding us inside the Bellwether Hotel. My hand stayed still. That was the first sign that something inside me had already made its decision. I picked up the pen. What no one noticed was the charcoal gray folder beneath my napkin. Evelyn Harrow had chosen the room, invited the town's most influential families, and seated me beneath a chandelier that cost more than my first work truck. She thought she had built a stage where I would either surrender or embarrass myself. She did not know I had brought a different script. By the time I met Daniel Harrow, I had spent 11 years building Northline Property Services from almost nothing. I began with a rusted Chevrolet, a secondhand mower, and $63 folded inside an envelope marked fuel. My first contract was a pharmacy parking lot outside Cedar Falls. I trimmed weeds, cleared trash, and slept 4 hours a night because losing one client meant missing payroll. Now Northline operated 41 vehicles, employed 79 people, and maintained hospitals, warehouses, apartment complexes, and municipal roads across 4 counties. During winter storms, our crews worked before dawn so ambulances and school buses could move safely, but I still drove the same faded pickup. My grandmother, June, taught me never to confuse display with value. She spent 35 years sewing uniforms in a factory outside Millbrook. Every morning she drank tea from a cracked yellow cup and fed scraps to a one-eyed terrier named Patch. She owned little, but repaired everything: boots, curtains, tools, even her favorite shovel. When I complained that our house looked poorer than my classmates' homes, she said, "What people inherit can disappear. What you learn to build stays inside you." She died when I was 20. The only thing of hers I kept was a pair of worn canvas work gloves. I carried them the day I hired my first employee, the day I bought our equipment yard, and the afternoon a hospital signed the contract that changed my company forever. They were in my coat pocket at the Bellwether Hotel, too. I met Daniel during a freezing rainstorm outside Westbridge Middle School. My crew had been called to salt the sidewalks. Daniel, a history teacher, was already there trying to break ice with a garden shovel that bent every time he struck the pavement. I showed him how to use the edge instead of the flat side. He laughed and asked whether I always rescued strangers before sunrise. We talked until my supervisor honked from the truck. He never asked what my company earned, how many people worked for me, or whether I owned the vehicles behind us. Instead, he noticed the paperback in my coat pocket and started arguing with me about its ending. That was why I gave him my number. For once, I had met a man interested in the person standing in front of him, not the number hidden behind her. Daniel's sister, Caroline, invited me to lunch 5 weeks before the wedding. She chose a quiet restaurant near the courthouse and arrived carrying a slim leather portfolio. For the first 10 minutes, she was warm, attentive, and almost convincing. She asked about the ceremony, complimented my ring, and said she hoped we could become real sisters. Then the questions began. Where exactly did I live? Did I own the house or rent it? Was my truck registered personally or through the company? How many employees did I have? Did the business operate all year or only during warmer months?
She kept her voice light, but every question landed with the precision of a form being completed. I answered honestly, though never completely. I said Northline was a modest operation. I said the truck belonged to the business. I said winter could be unpredictable. All of those statements were technically true, and none of them revealed anything meaningful. Caroline never opened the portfolio. That bothered me more than if she had written down every word. 2 weeks later, at a family cookout, I heard her speaking to one of Daniel's cousins near the drinks table. "It must be difficult for her in winter," Caroline said. "That kind of seasonal work is never reliable. At least Daniel can offer her some stability." I stood close enough to hear every word. I had never told her the company was seasonal. Snow removal alone produced some of our strongest months. I had never said money was difficult. She had taken a handful of cautious answers, invented the rest, and then repeated her invention as fact. My fingers tightened around my glass. For a moment, I considered walking over and correcting her in front of everyone. Instead, I set the drink down before my hand could shake and went outside. That evening, I tried to explain it to Daniel. "Your family keeps deciding things about me that aren't true," I said, "and then they tell those things to other people." He leaned back against the sofa and rubbed both hands over his face. "Caroline talks like that about everyone. She probably didn't mean anything by it. I want you to tell her she's wrong." He was quiet. Then he said, "I think you're giving this too much importance." It was not the answer I needed. Still, I let it go.
3 weeks after our engagement, she informed me that the wedding would take place at the Bellwether Hotel. "The Harrows have always held family weddings there," she said. She had already paid a deposit. She had selected a florist, reserved a string quartet, and spoken to a caterer before asking what food Daniel or I liked. She also announced that she would manage the guest list, because certain families had to be invited. When I said I wanted seats for 10 members of my senior crew, Evelyn paused. Those people had worked beside me through floods, blizzards, broken equipment, and years when I barely knew whether the company would survive. They were closer to family than most of the names on her list. "We'll see what space allows," she said. A week later, I called again. "We'll return to that," Evelyn replied before changing the subject to table linens. 10 days after that, I asked once more and received nearly the same answer. By the third conversation, I understood that she was not postponing the decision. She had already made it and simply did not consider me important enough to tell directly. Every call left a tight ache behind my left eye. I explained the situation to Daniel as calmly as I could. "My employees still aren't on the guest list. I'll speak with her," he promised. I never learned whether he did. The seats did not appear. I let the matter go, telling myself that 10 chairs were not worth turning a wedding into a war. At the time, I still believed surrendering small things would protect the important ones. 2 weekends later, I opened the wrong door at Ravenshore. I had been looking for a linen closet because Evelyn had asked me to bring fresh napkins to the terrace. Instead, I stepped into the study, the same room from which I had heard her call me a fortune hunter. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then I noticed the walls. Several pale rectangles interrupted the dark wood paneling. Clean outlines, where paintings had hung for years. I remembered one of them, a wide river landscape in a heavy gold frame that Daniel once said had belonged to his great-grandfather. Now it was gone. A glass cabinet near the fireplace stood half empty. Dustless circles marked the places where silver objects had recently been removed. 2 shelves that had held porcelain figures were bare. On the desk lay a stack of unopened envelopes. The top one carried the words, "Final Notice," in red letters. Beneath it, partly covered by a newspaper, was a glossy document from an auction company. I could read only a few lines from the doorway. "Private estate valuation. Confidential sale. Request for expedited appraisal." I stayed there longer than I should have. The house suddenly looked different. The peeling paint, the damaged ceiling, the taped window. Things I had dismissed as harmless neglect now seemed like evidence. I closed the door quietly and returned to the terrace with the napkins. The following Sunday, I tested Evelyn's story. "I always loved the river painting in the study," I said over lunch. "Has it been moved somewhere else?" She did not hesitate. "It's being restored. The frame had developed cracks." Her answer was smooth and immediate, too immediate. I had seen the auction paperwork with my own eyes. My hand slipped into my coat pocket and closed around my grandmother's gloves. Whenever the ground beneath me felt uncertain, I touched them without thinking. And suddenly the Harrows' behavior made sense in a way I had not expected. They did not despise me because they thought I had nothing. They despised me because they believed I was close enough to discover that they had almost nothing left. The name, the hotel, the lake house, the portraits, all of it was carefully maintained scenery. Behind it, pieces were being removed one at a time. The next morning, I called my attorney. Maya Ellis had represented Northline for nearly 7 years.
She had negotiated our municipal contracts, handled property purchases, and once spent 3 months dismantling a lawsuit from a competitor who assumed I would settle rather than fight. Her office overlooked the courthouse square. When I finished explaining the wedding, the insults, and the document Daniel's family wanted me to sign, she folded her hands on the desk. "Rachel," she said, "you own a company worth millions, several commercial properties, and investment accounts built before you met Daniel. Right now, none of that is properly protected." I thought marriage automatically kept previous assets separate. Sometimes. Until someone mixes accounts, invests marital money, signs the wrong document, or spends 5 years arguing about what belongs to whom. She slid a retainer agreement toward me. "We are not waiting until after the wedding to learn which interpretation a court prefers."
I kept telling myself the same story. The wedding was close, everyone was tense, and once Daniel and I were married, his family would stop treating me like an applicant whose references had not yet been checked. The first time I heard the phrase fortune hunter, I was standing in a hallway at Ravenshore. I had taken the wrong turn while looking for the downstairs bathroom. The corridor was dim, lined with old photographs and closed doors. As I passed the study, Evelyn's voice reached me through a narrow gap. "We cannot be careless," she said. "There is too much at stake." Caroline answered, but I could not make out the words. Then Evelyn spoke again. She saw the name Harrow and recognized an opportunity. Women like that always do. "She is a fortune hunter, nothing more." I stopped moving. The words seemed to press all the air out of the hallway. For 11 years, I had hidden my success because I feared being valued for money instead of character. I wore practical clothes, drove an old truck, and avoided conversations about the company's true size. And yet the Harrows had decided I wanted wealth I had never asked about and did not need. But one part of Evelyn's sentence disturbed me more than the insult. "There is too much at stake." Later, Caroline said something I could hear clearly. "We have to protect what remains." What remains? People do not use those words about a fortune that is growing. They use them about something disappearing. I walked back toward the dining room with a smile arranged carefully on my face. I told myself I might have misunderstood. Perhaps they were discussing someone else. Perhaps what remains referred to family heirlooms or land. That night, Daniel lay beside me reading while I stared at the ceiling. Finally, I asked, "Does your mother believe I'm marrying you for money?" His eyes stayed on the page a moment too long. "She assumes the worst about everyone," he said. "Don't take it personally." That isn't an answer. He closed the book. "Just don't give her reasons to make things difficult. Let her handle the wedding. Don't challenge every decision. It's easier that way." I turned away from him. I had asked Daniel to defend me. Instead, he had asked me to become quieter.
The final confirmation came through someone Maya knew from an estate case. Leon Barrett had spent 18 years valuing private art collections and inherited property. During lunch with Maya, he mentioned that he had recently visited an old lake estate outside West Bridge. The family wanted several paintings assessed for a discreet private sale. According to Leon, only 3 valuable pieces remained. The best items had apparently been sold years earlier, quietly and without public record. The owners had been unusually nervous about how quickly the appraisal could be completed. Maya never asked him for the family's name. She did not need to. The missing rectangles in the study, the empty cabinet, and the urgent auction paperwork had already given us the answer. After that, I assembled my folder. Inside it was Adrian's valuation, my full financial disclosure, and the fair prenuptial agreement Maya had prepared. On top, she placed a single page explaining in plain language what made such agreements valid. Separate lawyers, honest disclosure, and enough time for both people to make a free decision. I kept another section in the back. That section contained everything we knew about the Harrows' financial decline. I hoped I would never need to open it. Caroline revealed the purpose of the engagement dinner without realizing it. We were reviewing the seating plan when she said there would be 58 guests. "All the people who matter will be present," she added. "Everyone will witness you becoming part of the Harrow family." Witness. The word stayed with me long after the conversation ended. 58 respected guests. The Bellwether Hotel. The evening before the final wedding preparations. Every person seated where they could watch. It was not simply a celebration. It was a courtroom without a judge. A woman sitting alone at a kitchen table could refuse an unfair agreement. A woman surrounded by 58 staring faces, with her fiancé beside her and an expensive wedding only days away, might sign anything to avoid public humiliation. The audience was their pressure. My embarrassment was supposed to be their leverage. Once I understood that, I also understood something else. An audience could hear the truth just as clearly as an accusation. Daniel first mentioned the prenuptial agreement 3 weeks before the wedding. He stood near the kitchen counter, staring at the floor. "My mother thinks we should put a few things in writing," he said, "just so everyone feels secure." Caroline had an attorney prepare something. The document arrived the following afternoon. I read it twice. It did not protect both sides. Over the next 2 weeks, Maya explained what a legitimate prenuptial agreement required. Both parties needed independent legal counsel. Both parties needed full financial disclosure. And both parties needed enough time to review the terms freely, without threats, humiliation, or pressure. "A paper handed to someone during a family spectacle," she said, tapping her pen against the desk, "is not careful planning. It is coercion wearing formal clothes. Together, we prepared my own agreement. It stated clearly that Northline Property Services, its equipment, land, contracts, and accounts would remain entirely mine. It protected Daniel's existing property as well. Nothing unfair, nothing hidden, nothing designed to punish either of us. Maya had it notarized and stored a second copy in her office. Then she called Adrian Cole, a certified business valuation accountant who had spent 20 years assessing private companies. Adrian arrived at Northline with 2 laptops, 3 binders, and the expression of a man who trusted numbers more than people. For 4 hours, he examined payroll records, equipment schedules, land values, outstanding contracts, tax returns, and receivables. A week later, he placed his report in front of me. Northline and the assets connected to it were valued at just over $10 million. Adrian looked at me across the table. "This is not a woman with an old truck and a lawnmower," he said. "This is a serious company. Anyone who believes otherwise has never bothered to look." That evening, I placed the report beside my grandmother's gloves. For years, I had hidden what I built because secrecy felt safer. Now, the truth was becoming the only protection I had. The Bellwether Hotel looked magnificent from the entrance. Golden light spilled through tall windows, weight arrangements stood on every table. The ballroom ceiling glittered beneath 3 crystal chandeliers, and the Harrow family crest had been printed on the menus in raised silver lettering. But once I knew where to look, the illusion showed cracks. The flowers were artificial. The fabric covering the chairs had been reused often enough that the corners were worn. Only 6 servers worked a room that should have had twice that number. 58 guests arrived wearing old jewelry and expensive expressions, certain they were entering the world of a family whose wealth had never weakened. I knew differently. Evelyn moved from table to table, touching shoulders and greeting people by name. She looked radiant in ivory silk, performing generosity with the precision of someone who had practiced it all her life. Caroline followed close behind. Daniel's father, Thomas Harrow, sat quietly at the far end of the main table. During the 2 years I had known him, he had rarely spoken more than a few sentences at a time. That evening, he watched me carefully. When our eyes met, something shifted in his face. It looked almost like guilt. I took my seat beside Daniel. My gray folder rested inside my coat, pressed flat against the back of my chair. My grandmother's gloves were in the right pocket. Evelyn's document was partly hidden beneath her place setting, though not well enough to escape my notice. She wanted me to see it. She wanted me to spend the entire meal wondering when the humiliation would begin. The first course arrived. People raised glasses and congratulated Daniel. A former mayor told a story about attending his parents' wedding in the same ballroom. Someone mentioned legacy. Someone else praised Evelyn for preserving the family's traditions. Daniel barely touched his food. "Are you all right?" I asked. He nodded without looking at me. I could have told him everything then. I could have described Maya's agreement, Adrian's valuation, and the information about the missing paintings, but I had already given Daniel several chances to stand beside me before knowing what I was worth. He had chosen silence each time. I needed to see what he would choose when silence became impossible. The moment came after the salad plates were removed. Evelyn stood and tapped a spoon against her champagne glass. The ballroom softened into attention. She thanked everyone for attending and spoke beautifully about marriage, responsibility, and the sacrifices previous generations had made to build the Harrow name. Then her tone changed. "Of course," she said, "before Rachel officially joins our family, there is one small matter we must settle." She pulled the document from beneath her plate. Caroline smiled. Evelyn slid the pages across the table until they stopped in front of me. A silver pen followed. "For the protection of everyone involved," she continued, "Rachel needs to sign this agreement tonight." No one moved. I looked down at the document, though I already knew every paragraph. Then, Evelyn leaned forward. Her smile stayed in place, but her voice sharpened. "Go ahead," she said. "Sign it, fortune hunter. You arrived with nothing, and you will leave with nothing." The room became completely silent. Not shocked, expectant. 58 people turned toward me at once. Some looked uncomfortable, others looked fascinated. A few appeared almost satisfied, as though Evelyn had confirmed what they had suspected since seeing my old pickup outside.
It defined nearly everything I owned. Northline, the equipment yard, my investment accounts, and any property connected to the company as assets that could be transferred to the Harrow family trust if the marriage ended. There was no disclosure of what Daniel owned. There was no list of family assets. There was no statement confirming that I had received independent legal advice or sufficient time to review the terms. In the world imagined by that document, only one person possessed anything worth taking. I laid it on the kitchen table in front of Daniel. "Have you actually read this?" His eyes moved across the pages. He became quiet. Not surprised. Quiet. That was when I realized he already knew what it said. "What happens to Northline if we divorce?" I asked. He looked toward the window. "We're not going to divorce." "That isn't what I asked." He finally met my eyes. "Just sign it, Rachel. It's only paperwork. If we stay together, none of these clauses will ever matter." My hands turned cold.
Northline was not paperwork. It was 11 years of frozen mornings, missed holidays, damaged equipment, unpaid invoices, and employees who had trusted me with their livelihoods. It was everything I had built after beginning with almost nothing. People who inherit security often call contracts meaningless because they have never watched one sentence erase years of work. "I need time to think," I said. That night, I called Maya. "You already have your answer," she told me. "You have a fair agreement, complete disclosure, and proof of what you built. You do not need to beg them for permission to protect it." Then she paused. "They believe they own the table because their name is carved into it. Rachel, you could afford to buy the entire room." I placed my folder beside the front door. For the first time since meeting the Harrows, I stopped preparing to endure them. I began preparing to answer them.
I removed the first report from the folder and placed it face up on the white tablecloth. Northline Property Services, I read. Commercial grounds maintenance, winter road management, and municipal property services. My voice sounded surprisingly calm. 41 vehicles, 79 full-time employees, active contracts across 4 counties. The first page moved down the table, then the second. I listed the equipment yard, the 2 maintenance facilities, the company's outstanding receivables, and the investment accounts created from profits earned years before I met Daniel. Every figure had been verified by Adrian Cole and supported by tax records, property deeds, and signed contracts. No guesses, no exaggeration, just numbers. Combined estimated value, I said, $10,240,000. For several seconds, the room did not react. The number was too far from the story the Harrows had told for anyone to understand immediately. Then the calculations began. People looked from the report to my old dress, from my practical shoes to the document Evelyn had demanded I sign. One man near the window leaned toward his wife and whispered something. A woman at the next table lowered her champagne glass without drinking. Caroline's expression changed first. The satisfaction disappeared from her face. Her eyes moved rapidly over the pages as if she expected to find a mistake hidden in the margins. Evelyn remained standing. Her hand was still extended toward the silver pen, though there was no longer anyone waiting to take it. Thomas Harrow understood before the others. He stared at Adrian's valuation, then at the clause transferring my property into the Harrow family trust. The color drained from his face. His fingers slipped from his water glass, and he collapsed back into his chair so abruptly that the legs scraped against the floor. That sound finally broke the silence. Because Thomas knew the truth about both sides of the table. He knew what remained in the Harrow accounts. He knew which paintings had been sold, how many bills had gone unpaid, and what it cost each year to keep Ravenshore looking as though nothing had changed. And now he understood that the woman his wife had called a fortune hunter could have purchased the lake house, paid its debts, and still remained wealthier than the family judging her. I continued placing documents on the table. "This is my complete financial disclosure," I said. "It was prepared voluntarily and reviewed by independent counsel." Then I removed Maya's agreement. Beside me, Daniel went pale. He did not speak. Caroline watched with bright, hungry attention. Evelyn held the pen toward me. She expected tears, anger, or surrender. Instead, I smiled. Then I accepted the pen. A quiet breath moved through the room. I placed the point against the signature line and paused. Evelyn's shoulders relaxed. She believed she had won. But I did not write my name. I lifted the document and began reading aloud. "Upon termination of the marriage," I said clearly, "the second party shall surrender all business interests, real property, investment holdings, and financial accounts brought into the union to the Harrow Family Trust." Several guests shifted in their seats. I looked directly at Evelyn. "I am the second party." Her smile weakened. "So this agreement does not merely prevent me from taking Harrow property, it gives my property to your family." No one reached for a glass or fork. I continued. "There is no disclosure describing Daniel's assets. There is no confirmation that I received independent legal advice. And there is no record showing that I was given reasonable time to negotiate." Caroline interrupted. "That is standard language." "No," I said. "It is not." I placed the pen beside the untouched signature line. Then I reached behind my chair, removed the gray folder, and laid it on the table. "There is one more problem," I said. Evelyn stared at it. "A fair agreement requires both families to reveal what they actually own." I opened the folder. "So let us begin with mine." I stood and looked at Evelyn. "I will not sign your agreement," I said, "and I will not marry into a family that turns humiliation into entertainment." No one interrupted me. Then I turned toward Daniel. His face was still pale. For 2 years, I had watched him avoid conflict with his mother by pretending that silence was neutrality. Every time Evelyn insulted me, excluded my people, or rewrote my life into something smaller, Daniel had asked me to be patient. Now there was nowhere left for him to hide. "I will marry you Tuesday morning at the Cedar Falls courthouse," I said. "No hotel, no family crest, no audience. We will sign the affair agreement Maya prepared, and the only thing exchanged between us will be a promise.
I placed one hand on the closed folder. Or I will leave tonight, wish you well, and continue building my life without you. Daniel looked at me. Then he glanced toward his mother. Evelyn's composure returned just enough for her to speak. Daniel, sit down, she said. She is trying to embarrass this family. I almost laughed. After everything she had done, Evelyn still believed embarrassment belonged only to her. Daniel remained motionless. His father stared at the table. Caroline whispered his name, warning him with a single word. For several long seconds, I watched 34 years of obedience fight with the part of Daniel that had once stood outside a school before sunrise, clearing ice because children needed a safe path inside. Then he pushed back his chair. Evelyn reached for his arm. He stepped away from her. Daniel walked around the head table and stopped beside me. His hands were shaking, but when he took mine, his grip was firm. You just showed me what everyone in this family values, he told his mother, and I should have seen it much sooner. Evelyn's face hardened. You are throwing away your inheritance. Thomas Harrow finally lifted his head. There is no inheritance, he said. The words were quiet, but they struck harder than anything else spoken that evening. Evelyn turned toward him. Thomas did not look away. The accounts cannot support Ravenshore for another year, he continued. The remaining investments are nearly gone. The hotel deposit was paid with money borrowed against the house. A murmur spread through the ballroom. Caroline stood so quickly that her chair tipped backward. Dad, stop! No, Thomas said. We should have stopped years ago. Evelyn stared at him as if he had betrayed her more deeply than I ever could.
This is a fair prenuptial contract. It protects everything Daniel owned before marriage. It protects everything I owned before marriage. Neither person receives the other's property through divorce. I looked at Evelyn. That is what protection looks like. She lowered her hand. For the first time since I had met her, she had no immediate response. There was still another section in my folder. Inside it were photographs of the empty spaces in the study, notes about the estate appraisal, and records connected to the Harrows' private sales. I could have exposed everything. I could have described the final notices and the artwork leaving Ravenshore one piece at a time. I could have stripped away the family's performance in front of every person Evelyn had invited to watch mine collapse. But that would have made me exactly what she accused me of being, someone who came to the table searching for what she could take. So I left that section closed. You called me a fortune hunter, I said quietly. My words were meant for Evelyn, but the entire ballroom heard them. Perhaps we should discuss what fortune was actually left for me to hunt. The expression beneath her perfect smile appeared for only a second. Fear. Not anger. Not pride. Fear. Caroline pushed back her chair. This proves nothing, she said quickly. Rachel still has not signed a binding agreement, and neither has Daniel. A valuation report does not change the legal situation. Her voice was louder than before and less controlled. Any competent attorney in this room will agree. At the table beside us, an elderly man in a gray suit placed his fork carefully on his plate. I recognized him as Judge Samuel Mercer, retired from the State Circuit Court. He turned slightly toward Caroline. A contract presented publicly days before a wedding, he said, without separate representation, mutual disclosure, or genuine negotiation, would have serious difficulty surviving a legal challenge. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The authority in his tone carried across the ballroom. Caroline's face became as pale as the tablecloth. I closed the folder. The Harrows had invited 58 witnesses to watch me surrender. Instead, they had created 58 witnesses to their own attempt to take everything I had built.
Tuesday morning arrived cold and clear. The courthouse opened at 8:30. Daniel and I were there at 8:15. There were no flowers, no musicians, and no rows of guests measuring the value of our clothes. I wore a navy dress I already owned. Daniel wore the same charcoal suit he used for school ceremonies. Maya met us on the courthouse steps carrying 2 copies of the agreement. Daniel had hired his own attorney, Marcus Webb, the day after the dinner. Marcus had reviewed every page separately with him, requested several small revisions, and confirmed in writing that Daniel understood the terms. That mattered to me, not because I expected our marriage to fail, but because love was not an excuse to leave one person unprotected. Inside a small conference room, Daniel and I exchanged full financial disclosures. His were simple: a modest retirement account, his townhouse, some savings, and a share in a family trust that Thomas had already warned might soon be worthless. There was no shame in the size of it. The shame had never been having less. The shame was pretending to possess more while trying to take from someone else. Daniel read my valuation slowly, even though he already knew the total from the dinner. I had no idea, he said. That was intentional. Why didn't you tell me? I looked at him across the table. Because I wanted to know whether you loved me before you knew. His expression tightened. And now? Now I need to know whether you can love me without allowing other people to punish me for succeeding. He signed the agreement, then I signed.
Maya and Marcus witnessed both signatures, and a clerk notarized the documents. Nothing was rushed. No one raised their voice. No one used an audience as a weapon. That was what a choice looked like when it was actually free. We were married 20 minutes later in a small courtroom with wooden benches and a state flag in the corner. Thomas came alone. He stood near the back, wearing an old brown coat, and held a plain envelope in both hands. When the ceremony ended, he approached me cautiously. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Yes," I replied. He nodded, accepting the answer. I knew what Evelyn and Caroline were planning. I told myself staying quiet would prevent a worse scene. It created one. I understand that now. He handed me the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter and a photograph of the river painting that had once hung in the study. Thomas explained that the painting had been sold 3 months earlier to cover overdue property taxes. Ravenshore had been mortgaged twice. Most of the family investments had disappeared through years of poor decisions, expensive appearances, and attempts to preserve a lifestyle no longer supported by income. Evelyn had refused to reduce expenses. Caroline had convinced herself that Daniel's marriage could somehow solve the problem. "They believed you owned a small business," Thomas said. "But they also believed even a small business was more valuable than what remained." I looked at him. So the agreement was never about protecting Daniel? No.
But I did not feel victorious. I felt tired. This was the truth I had chosen not to reveal, and now it was coming from the only person who had the right to reveal it. Daniel squeezed my hand. We walked away from the table together, past the champagne glasses no one would raise, past the artificial flowers and silver menus, past 58 guests silently recalculating everything they believed about the Harrow family and the woman they had assumed arrived with nothing. At the ballroom doors, Evelyn called Daniel's name. He paused, but did not turn around. "If you leave with her," she said, "do not expect to come back." Daniel looked at me. For the first time since I had known him, he did not seem like a man waiting for someone else's permission. "Then I won't," he answered. We stepped outside into cold night air. The hotel lights reflected on the wet pavement. My old pickup waited near the far end of the parking lot, parked between 2 luxury cars. Daniel released a long breath. "I failed you," he said. "Yes," I replied. He looked surprised by the directness. I was done softening truths to make them easier for other people to hear. "You let them disrespect me because confronting them was uncomfortable. You knew the agreement was wrong, and you still asked me to sign it. I thought it would keep the peace. It would have kept their peace, not mine." He lowered his head. "I don't know how to fix this." "You don't fix 2 years in one conversation." I reached into my pocket and touched my grandmother's gloves. "But Tuesday morning is where you can begin proving that you understand." Daniel nodded. I unlocked the truck. For the first time that evening, neither of us looked back at the Bellwether Hotel.
The weeks after the courthouse ceremony were quieter than I expected. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public apologies, and no sudden transformation inside the Harrow family. Real consequences rarely arrive with music. They appear as unanswered calls, changed locks, separate holiday plans, and names quietly removed from invitations. Evelyn sent Daniel 7 messages during the first 2 days. The first accused me of manipulating him. The second warned that I would abandon him once I had access to whatever remained of the family's reputation. By the 7th, her anger had become a request. She wanted him to convince me to loan the family enough money to keep Ravenshore from foreclosure. Daniel showed me the message without comment. "What are you going to say?" I asked. "No." He typed the word and sent it before he could reconsider. It was a small act, but I understood how much it cost him. For most of his life, Daniel had been trained to believe that refusing Evelyn was a form of betrayal. Saying no once did not erase that training. It simply proved he was capable of resisting it. Caroline took a different approach. She emailed Northline's public office address and requested a formal meeting about a mutually beneficial investment opportunity. She attached a proposal describing Ravenshore as a historic hospitality property with untapped commercial potential. The proposal did not mention the overdue taxes, the existing mortgages, or the structural repairs the house required. Maya read it and laughed once. "She is trying to sell you the privilege of rescuing them." I instructed our office manager to decline. Caroline wrote again, this time reminding me that family should help family. I replied personally. Family does not begin with public humiliation and end with a loan request. She never answered. Thomas moved out of Ravenshore before winter. He rented a small apartment near the courthouse and began working with a financial advisor to settle the remaining debts. He sold the house voluntarily rather than waiting for the bank to take it. After the mortgages, taxes, and maintenance bills were paid, very little remained. The property was purchased by a nonprofit organization that planned to turn it into a rehabilitation center for injured veterans. Evelyn called the sale a disgrace. Thomas called it the first honest decision the family had made in years. Daniel visited his father every Sunday.
"It was about taking my company." Thomas lowered his eyes. "Yes,
Daniel stood beside me, silent. This time, however, his silence did not feel like avoidance. It felt like someone finally allowing an ugly truth to remain visible instead of covering it with excuses. Thomas asked whether Daniel wanted to return to Ravenshore to collect his belongings. Daniel said no. "I'll arrange another time," he replied. "Not while Mom is there." Thomas nodded. Before leaving, he looked at me once more. "You could have destroyed them in that ballroom." "I know. Why didn't you?" I slipped the photograph back into the envelope. "Because I wanted to protect what I built. I didn't want to become cruel just because cruelty would have been easy." After Thomas left, Daniel and I walked down the courthouse steps. There was no crowd waiting outside, no champagne, no photographer. Only my old pickup beneath a row of bare trees. Daniel stopped beside the passenger door. "I know marrying me today doesn't erase what I did." "It doesn't. I also know standing beside you once doesn't prove I'll keep doing it." "No." He nodded. "Then I'll prove it one decision at a time." I unlocked the truck. That was not a romantic promise. It was better. It was honest.
A year after our courthouse wedding, Northline won the largest contract in its history. The county selected us to maintain every emergency services property in the region: fire stations, ambulance depots, public clinics, and the roads connecting them during severe weather. The agreement allowed me to hire 23 more employees and open a second operations yard near Millbrook. At the signing ceremony, I wore my grandmother's gloves beneath the table, not because I was afraid, because she deserved to be there. Daniel sat in the front row beside Thomas. When the county commissioner announced Northline's name, Daniel stood before anyone else and applauded until the whole room joined him. He never once mentioned the company's value afterward. Instead, he asked how many workers the new contract would support and whether I had remembered to eat lunch. That was the difference I had needed him to learn. Evelyn did not attend. After Ravenshore was sold, she moved into a smaller condominium owned by a distant relative. She continued telling anyone who listened that I had destroyed the Harrow family. Perhaps believing that story was easier than admitting the family had been collapsing long before I entered it. Caroline eventually left Westbridge and joined a law firm in another state. Before she moved, she sent me one final email. She did not apologize. She wrote that the engagement dinner had become an unfortunate misunderstanding and suggested that we both contributed to the conflict. I deleted the message. Some people use the word misunderstanding when they want forgiveness without accepting responsibility. Thomas changed more than any of them. He volunteered twice a week at the rehabilitation center that opened inside the former Ravenshore estate. The study where the missing paintings had once hung became a therapy room. The empty cabinet held medical supplies. The terrace where Evelyn had questioned my worth became a place where recovering soldiers ate lunch with their families. One Sunday, Thomas invited Daniel and I to visit. I had not returned since the house was sold. The taped window had been replaced. The water damage was repaired. The dark hallways were brighter, and the Harrow portraits had been removed from the walls. Near the entrance hung a simple plaque thanking the donors, builders, nurses, and maintenance crews who had restored the property. Northline's name was listed among them. Thomas noticed me reading it. "The place finally belongs to people who need it," he said. For the first time, Ravenshore looked alive. Daniel and I remained married, though not because a courthouse signature magically repaired everything. Trust returned slowly. It grew through ordinary moments, difficult conversations he did not escape, boundaries he held when Evelyn called, and apologies offered without excuses. I learned to share more of myself, instead of testing whether people would love a version of me stripped of every visible success.
Sometimes I went with him, sometimes I did not. Forgiveness, I learned, did not require pretending that trust had already returned. At Northline, life continued. Winter arrived early, bringing 2 heavy storms before December. Trucks left the yard at 3 in the morning. Radios crackled in the dispatch office. Crews spread salt across hospital entrances and cleared municipal roads while the rest of the county slept. Daniel joined me one Saturday. He wore borrowed reflective gear and spent 6 hours helping a crew clear sidewalks near the medical center. His technique had improved since the morning we met, though he still tried to lift too much at once. "You're gonna hurt your back," I told him. "You said that the first time. You didn't listen then either." He smiled. For a few minutes, standing beneath the falling snow, we felt like the people we had been before the Harrows turned our relationship into a test. But we were not those people anymore. That was not entirely a loss. I had stopped believing love meant avoiding difficult truths. Daniel had stopped believing peace could be preserved by asking the injured person to remain silent. We started counseling. He learned to recognize how often he minimized conflict because it frightened him. I learned that hiding every part of my success had not only protected me from greedy people, it had also prevented good people from knowing me completely. There is a difference between privacy and fear. For years, I had called both of them caution. One afternoon, I returned to the equipment yard and found Daniel standing beside my pickup. He had cleaned the cab and repaired the broken latch on the glove compartment. Inside, my grandmother's work gloves rested exactly where I had left them. He had not moved them. "I know they matter," he said. I picked them up and ran my thumb across the worn fabric. "They remind me where I started." Daniel looked toward the rows of Northline trucks parked beneath the gray sky. "You don't need the reminder." "Yes," I said. "Everyone does. Because success can make people forget how easily appearances lie. A grand house can be empty. An old truck can belong to a millionaire. And sometimes the person accused of reaching for another family's fortune is the only person at the table who built one honestly." We both stopped confusing secrecy with safety.
On our first anniversary, Daniel took me back to Westbridge Middle School. Snow covered the parking lot where we had met. He brought 2 shovels and handed me the better one. "Do you still think I'm doing it wrong?" he asked. "Yes," he laughed. We cleared the front walkway together before the buses arrived. When we finished, he pulled a small box from his coat. Inside was a silver pen. For one terrible second, I thought he was making a joke about the engagement dinner. Then I saw the inscription, "What you build cannot be taken." I closed my hand around it. My grandmother had taught me that worth was built, not inherited. For years, I thought she meant companies, property, and money earned through work. Now I understood she had meant something larger. Worth was also the courage to leave a table where respect was conditional. It was the restraint not to destroy people when the truth already could. It was the wisdom to forgive slowly, without forgetting. And it was knowing that love should never require you to surrender the life you built before it arrived. Evelyn had placed a pen in my hand, expecting me to sign away everything. Instead, that night became the moment I finally stopped making myself smaller for people who needed me to appear poor so they could feel rich. I still drive the old pickup. The dent remains in the tailgate, my grandmother's gloves remain in the compartment, and Daniel still complains that the heater takes too long to work. People see it and make assumptions. I let them. A person who judges worth by appearances will eventually reveal far more about themselves than they ever discover about you.